Welcome to Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston, PhD. Dr. Glenn is a clinical psychologist and former multi-million-dollar consultant to the big food industry and uses his experience to help you defeat your cravings. This show will help you to focus on dramatically reducing cravings and leaving the diet mentality behind, so you can more easily and effortlessly achieve your health, fitness, and body composition goals. Please remember, no doctor-patient relationship is created via this show, and you are responsible for confirming any changes to your diet, health, or psychological routines with an appropriately licensed professional before implementing them. Before we get started, if you haven't downloaded the free smartphone app to access dozens of these recordings all in one place, as well as to avail yourself of a confidential community for support, motivation, and assistance, please visit the podcast link on defeatyourcravings.com as soon as possible. And now, here's your host, Dr. Glenn Livingston.
Howie, could you help me to tell this story in a meaningful way to our listeners?
Absolutely. I remember, I think it was maybe 2015, you sent me this manuscript, and I started reading it because I'm a nice guy. I didn't really think you would have anything that exciting to say. And by page 4, my jaw was on the floor. I'm like, this is amazing. This is going to change lives. It's already changed mine in how I think about things. And I've seen the evolution from that first draft, which we will not share the name that you gave to that book, but then how it continued and grew and how you've been refining and constantly, like even when you have like a successful business with hundreds of thousands of readers, up to 1 million readers, like one of the things that really impressed me is that you kept on changing the methodology as you discovered new things. And you never were wedded to, your ego, like, here's what I discovered. You're always looking for the new. So I think I'm a little bit behind the times because we haven't really gone in depth in a year maybe. So I'm really eager to hear sort of the evolution and like where you are now and how things have progressed.
I would be very grateful to have you help me tell that story. What was it that changed your life in the first 4 pages?
It was just the concept that the voice that was telling me to binge, to give in to cravings, wasn't me. That I could play a little game and give it a name, give it a character, and make rules and make decisions for myself, and that whatever that voice said didn't matter. I used to think that that voice was me and there was nothing I could do. It's almost like, like you're playing a tug of war against this incredibly powerful opponent, much bigger than you, much stronger than you. And that's what it was like for me with some of the cravings I had. And it was certainly like that for some of my clients. And my technique was to try to get them strong enough to win the tug of war. Your technique was, dummy, drop the rope.
That's funny. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. I had not conceptualized it like this, when I first discovered that about 20 years ago. I hadn't conceptualized that. I was just suffering myself, and I'd spent a lifetime suffering. I come from a family of 17 psychologists and psychotherapists, and when anything breaks in the house, everybody knows how to ask it how it feels, but nobody knows how to fix it, which is kind of funny and kind of not, because when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I really thought that inner voice that would say, oh, go ahead, Glenn, you worked out hard enough. You're not going to gain any weight. Have that chocolate bar and just one bite won't hurt. And all those kind of crazy things we tell ourselves to break our best laid plans. I really thought that was a manifestation of the inner psychological pain that I was suffering. I thought if I could heal the hole in my heart, that I wouldn't have to keep trying to fill it in my stomach. And I went to all the best doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, and I took medication, and I went to Overdose Anonymous, and I went on a spiritual journey, which was all extraordinarily meaningful. But, every time I would learn something about myself, I'd lose a little weight, and then I gained a bunch more. And I lose a little weight, and I gain a bunch more. It's like there was this dialogue in my head of constant ambivalence. Maybe I should do this, maybe I should do that. I couldn't really recognize when there was a thought in my head that was justifying indulgence. And I was just, I would say, very, very distracted from doing the practical things that would make a difference. It turned out that we have the right to organize our thoughts in any way that we want. And that by drawing really clear lines in the sand, like saying, I'll never have chocolate on a weekday again, that I was suddenly able to clearly bifurcate, to clearly distinguish the thoughts that encourage me to break my plan from the thoughts that encourage me to stay with my plan. It became this vehicle for being able to know what was a constructive thought and what was a destructive thought about food. And I said, well, let me stop changing my mind about exactly what rules I'm going to follow and what method I'm going to use. What if I just make it really, really clear? And if we can come back to this, that was a result of not only being a psychologist, which I think got in my way more than anything, but also having worked in industry. I was on the wrong side of the war. I was consulting for big food companies and big pharma too. We can come back to that. But I just had a very, very strong need to do very practical things to stop being persuaded by this inner destructive voice. It's a little embarrassing because I wasn't trying to teach this back then. I was just trying to get out of my own pain. I called that voice my inner pig. I probably shouldn't. I should have come up with another word, but I called it my inner pig. And if I was at a Starbucks and I heard this little voice that said, just start your silly diet tomorrow or start your silly rule tomorrow, I would say, wait a minute, that's not me. That's my inner pig. It's squealing for pig slop. Chocolate on a Wednesday is pig slop. I don't need pig slop. I don't let farm animals tell me what to do. And it gave me this ability to wake up at the moment of impulse and make the right choice. I wish I could say it was an instant miracle and that I always made the right choice. I really didn't. But it always woke me up because I'd have this feeling of, whoa, who's in charge here? I don't want some farm animal in charge of my life. The ability to wake up gave me an opportunity to really study in much more detail what was happening, to develop some new ideas and insights. And mostly, it gave me the ability to make the choice not to listen to the pig. If I had my wits about me, I could think about why it was wrong. Like, for example, you can't start tomorrow because if you have a craving for chocolate and you indulge that today by saying, I'll just start tomorrow, you've reinforced both the craving and the thought. So you're more likely to think I'll start tomorrow, and you're more likely to have a stronger craving tomorrow. So when you're in a hole, stop digging. You can only use the present moment to be healthy. So when I had my wits about me and the opportunity to breathe and think and write, I could reason my way through what was wrong with what the pig was saying. But mostly, I would just ignore it. Mostly, I'd just say, I know there's something wrong with what it's saying. I don't know exactly what it is. I know that this leads to no good. Whatever it's doing, it's active. It leads to no good. So I'm just going to ignore it. Let me think about what else I need. Do I need something healthy to eat? Do I need to take a break from the rat race? Do I need some human connectedness? Do I need some sunshine? Do I need to breathe for a little bit? What else do I really need? Slowly but surely, which was over the course of many years for me, I kept a journal of what I said versus what the pig said, and the times when my wits were about me and I had the energy to reason my way through, they got me stronger and stronger. The pig stopped making sense. I started taking better care of myself over time. I've been at different weights over the years, but I'm thin. I've been thin for 15, 20 years now. I was probably close to 300. I stopped weighing myself at 257 because I couldn't stand it. And my triglycerides were through the roof, and I probably lost about somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds at that time. And I've stayed more or less where I am, except when I do a lot of weightlifting and stuff, my body fat goes down, but my weight goes up a little. So that's it, Howie. The bifurcation, which occurred to me after decades of trying to love myself thin, and only occurred to me because of some books that I'd read, like Rational Recovery by Jack Trimpey, who does something similar in the alcohol and drug recovery space. Having seen the food industry engineering these hyperpalatable concentrations of starch and sugar and fat and excitotoxins and salt aimed at hitting the bliss point in the reptilian brain without giving us enough nutrition to feel satisfied. And the advertising industry is actually very good at making us believe we need these things. People think advertising doesn't affect them, but it affects you more when you think that because your sales resistance is down. Like all those things were part of the mix of getting me to change my paradigm and turn into more like the alpha dog as opposed to trying to love myself thin. But that's what happened. And it all started with that bifurcation that hit you in the first 4 pages.
Yeah. So can I ask more about what you called your inner pig? And you said like, maybe I shouldn't have, but it was perfect for you at that time. So I think one of the things I've learned is that this only works if we empower ourselves fully to use it. So that inner voice, you talk about like, being in charge of it, being the alpha. But a lot of people are uncomfortable with that idea of like being bifurcated. Can you talk about like what it is in your understanding? What is the voice, the food monster, the inner pig, the food demon, whatever somebody wants to call it? From a biophysio-psychological level, what are we dealing with? Where does it come from, and what is it like?
I like that word, man. Biophysical, psychosocial.
Yeah, ethnomusicological.
Okay, well, first of all, it's understandable that some people would object. And a lot of people had been abused in their youth. And the word they'll use is they'll say it's triggering or something like that. And I understand that. And I suggest that those people don't use that word. You call it your food monster or your inner creature. Your creature could cry for crud, or your screecher could scream for scraps, whatever you want to call it. You don't have to say your inner pig is squealing for slop. What you should understand is that people's self-esteem improves when they master their ability to eat what they decide they're going to eat. When you can move your more difficult and troubling food decisions from your emotions and whims to your intellect, there's a sense of mastery, empowering control, and being able to engineer your own fate that it improves self-esteem. It doesn't degrade it. And because of the way I'm defining this inner voice, there is a physical parallel, but it's not perfect. I find it's better to just define the inner voice as any thought, feeling, impulse, or image which suggests that you will cross a particular line in the sand that you've drawn about food or food behavior. So if you say, I will never begin a meal without taking 3 deep breaths again, which is just a mindful rule. It's not a rule that makes you give up any particular food or treat or anything like that. It just increases your awareness. Then any thought, feeling, image, or impulse that suggests that you are going to eat without taking 3 deep breaths becomes your food monster. So when you understand that definition, first of all, it eliminates all the ambiguity and makes it crystal clear. But also you can understand that that voice, it doesn't have anything constructive about it. It's not defined in the same way that your inner wounded child is, which would have sought out rich sources of calories and fat and salt to protect you against trauma that you went through. It's not defined in such a way that it's a part of your shadow that you need to accept and integrate and love. I endorse and support all of that work. I think that part of the reason I am who I am, and I've got this soulful connections and ability to enjoy life in so many ways, is because I did all that work. But I find that that work also interferes with doing the very practical things that are necessary to stop overeating, to stick to the plans. And so when you really understand the way that the voice is defined, it becomes less aberrant. And like I say, you don't have to use the words that I did. You could think of it as your inner food monster. It's just the set of thoughts and feelings that want you to break the rules. That's all.
We have been around as a species for a long time. What is it about now that makes things so much worse? That makes it so every other animal except humans, and I would argue our companion animals, our pets, follows its own inner voice and eats. Like the squirrel is like, oh, I'm going to have some nuts today, and the squirrel isn't like, oh, I should have one. Could I have one more? No, I really shouldn't. Why can we no longer trust that inner voice to guide us?
If it was 100,000 years ago, we could fairly easily eat when we were hungry and stop when we're full. I don't think Thag was sitting around talking to Marta, at the campfire in the cave saying, oi, Thag, eat too much mammoth, or, too many bananas. I think that the foods that nature intended on our species-specific diets, I think that they're designed with enough guar and pectin and fiber to slow down our intake and the glycemic uptake of the nutritional load that you're taking in and the caloric load that you're taking in that our systems have developed over millions of years, or run into people who don't really believe in evolution, even if you want to say God put it there like that, it was the way that nature or God intended. And so we have natural defenses against overloading. At this time in our modern food environment, the industry is taking advantage of those natural buttons inside of our brain. For example, a food bar manufacturer, I remember, designed their packaging to be multicolored and vibrant and bright. In nature, if you were to come across a multi-vibrant patch of fruits and vegetables like blueberries and red tomatoes and green lettuce and bright orange carrots, you're going to get a diversity of micronutrients. And your brain knows that. And so there's a kind of variety and color impulse in the brain that responds to those things in nature. Well, this food bar manufacturer, at the same time as they were focusing on roughly the same time as they were focusing on the packaging, they also removed the vitamins from the bar. I don't mean to single them out. It goes on across the whole industry, but that's an example of what's happening. So you're getting the calories, but you're not really getting enough nutrition to make you feel satisfied. It trips a wire in your brain. It says, what's going on? This was supposed to give me what I needed. I must need more. They use the variety impulse also to make sure that you keep eating. Like when you open a bag of chips, it's often not manufactured on a unitary assembly line where every chip tastes exactly the same. I learned this from a client. They'll take half a dozen assembly lines and vary the taste on each one just slightly, like almost imperceptibly. But that unconsciously, you're experiencing a variation in taste. And just like with the variation in color, the variation in taste could signal a variation in micronutrients. And so the brain has developed a button to keep eating when that happens. It gets a little more nefarious with some manufacturers. There are chemicals you can put into things to turn off your ability to feel full. But I mean, basically how we now, as opposed to 100,000 years ago, we've got all these fat cats in white suits with mustaches laughing all the way to the bank when we're looking for love at the bottom of a bag or a box or a container. We're up against a tremendous offense. Simultaneously, the demands of modern life have accelerated at a ridiculously fast pace. You could look at the scene changes on television, and whereas there used to be maybe half a dozen or a dozen scenes in an hour, now it's at least double that. We have the internet and the airwaves and constant input that we have to process and make decisions about. And willpower is very much related to the ability to make good decisions. There are only so many good decisions you can make over the course of the day. The demands of work have accelerated in modern life so that people need a break. And what's happened is society has evolved to tacitly support each other to slowly kill themselves with food. Everybody laughs it off, ho, 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 ha, 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 he, he. Just hand over the chocolate and nobody gets hurt. But we're killing ourselves, and all you have to do is look at the World Health Organization stats to see, the rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and some diet preventable or diet reversible forms of cancer. We're killing ourselves. Lewis Black said he knew that the world was ending when he walked out of a Starbucks and across the street there was another Starbucks. I don't even really think Starbucks is a horrific culprit.
There's a restaurant near me that advertises the Widowmaker, and it's this giant hamburger with like 3 layers of meat with cheese in between. And if you called it a Widowmaker, it's cute. Like I'm thinking about like couples going in and basically saying, ma'am, would you like to, kill your husband? Here's a table for 2.
Yeah. We live in a world that's a perfect storm, but there is a defense. It just requires a little bit of thinking and planning, and thankfully we can opt out. You don't have to opt out entirely either. It turns out that for probably 2 out of 3 people, most treats can be moderated. So, if you really want to be able to have a bag of chips or 2 every week in a very limited contextualized way, you can do that. It turns out it has to do with setting very clear boundaries and binding it to very specific sets of conditions so that your reptilian brain isn't constantly firing, saying chips are for lunch, chips are for lunch, chips are for lunch.
Uh-huh. Let me ask about that, because your methodology has drawn criticism from so many different perspectives. And one of them is sort of the all or nothing blank anonymous perspective, which is abstinence is either the only way or the safest way or the sanest way. But when you have people create rules, they don't have to be all or never rules. They can be contextual. They can be conditional. How do you answer that criticism of people saying, like, if it's not good for it's like cigarettes or cocaine, or like those are the metaphors that this camp tends to use.
First of all, there are people who need to abstain, and it's usually sugar, flour, and alcohol. That's usually what it comes down to. There are people who need to do that. And I can't always tell up front who those people are. We can talk about some methods to try, but the bottom line is there's no way that I can remove the risk for you. So you have to decide whether it's worth the risk for you to take that or not. If you understand the way that cravings work in the brain, I'll give you a little background, then you'll understand why it's possible to moderate. Cravings are mostly, if not entirely, food signal dependent. In our past, we probably had to be exceptionally good at finding food because it wasn't as abundant, it wasn't nearly as abundant as it is now. So the theory goes, which I'm convinced of, we developed the ability to link the availability of calories and nutrition to particular signals, at first in the environment, and then in some ways it can also be in response to internal conditions. For example, suppose that, let's go back to our guy Thag 100,000 years ago. Suppose that Thag came across a chimp in the wild, and he happened to follow that chimp to a banana tree. And that banana tree was abundant, and so Thag had the opportunity to create an association that says, oh, if you followed chimps, you get to eat a lot of bananas. When Thag saw another chimp in the wild, it would initiate a craving, which is nothing more than the motivation to go and find bananas by, following Thag to the tree.
So this is like nature's way of raising the odds that we're going to survive. It's an association, a learned association that makes it likely that, if eating calories is good, which it is, because we need them to survive, then the signal of chimp will then motivate Thag to go look for bananas. So he's just sort of built a sort of a one-way association, a relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Right, exactly. One important implication of this, which is a little bit of a sidetrack, but I want to take it for a moment, is that if you have very strong cravings, it's a sign that you have a very healthy brain doing its job. It just means that 100,000 years ago, you would have been particularly good at following chimps. You would have had particularly strong motivation. And that's really important because there's so much mythology out there about cravings being a sign of a sickness or an underlying disease or something that's really negative and bad. No, it just means that you've got a healthy brain that's capable of forming the motivational associations that you were supposed to perform to survive. Unfortunately, in the modern food environment, that tendency, that ability will get attached to the donut store sign or the fast food sign, a set of arches or a brand logo or a song or a smell that a particular restaurant puts into their air. We just call those food signals. And when you have an overeating problem, usually there are a few signals that signal the availability of that particular food source. That association is what needs to be made dormant in order to overcome the craving. And so let's say you always see the donut store sign on your way home from work and you stop at the donut store and you get coffee and a donut. Your brain is going to motivate you as soon as you see the sign to crave going in and get the coffee and the donut. If you don't do that, your brain is going to make you uncomfortable. It does this by altering levels of dopamine, which is associated with pleasure or unhappiness, depending upon what the level is. Higher levels are associated with pleasure, lower levels are associated with discomfort. However, if you continue to pass the donut store sign day after day without going in, after somewhere between 21 and 30 exposures, your brain is going to say, oh, I guess donut store signs don't lead to coffee and a donut anymore. It'll begin to stop bothering you. That process is not linear. There's a honeymoon period, then a bit of a temper tantrum, and then it goes down linearly for a while. Then there are a couple of little spikes. But by and large, a month later, your brain is not going to make you expend nearly the same energy in response to the donut store sign.
So is this what's known as the extinction response?
Yeah, the extinction curve. Going back to your question about why it's possible to eat things in moderation, if you say, I will never eat bread except for once per calendar week on Saturdays at a restaurant when I can have 2 slices. Well, what happens is you wind up extinguishing all of the signals for bread. So you wind up extinguishing the smell of the bread at a restaurant on a Wednesday, the bagel store sign. You wind up extinguishing, your mom's apartment where she's made home baked bread. Because you're not responding to those signals, your brain eventually labels those signals as dormant. It doesn't erase them, by the way, they're still there, and you can reactivate them pretty quickly, but it labels them as dormant, except for the very particular combination of signals, which is, a restaurant on Saturday where you can have 2 pieces. It begins to extinguish everything else. It takes a little longer than, the 30 days that it would take to extinguish the daily bread if you did it all together. But eventually, your brain learns this is the only time that bread's available. And the brain is very efficient. It doesn't want to waste energy. If you put a prisoner in a cell, initially they're looking for ways to escape and expending all their time and energy and thought on planning an escape. But if they realize that it's impossible, they don't want to hope for it anymore. They don't want to crave escape anymore because it's a waste of energy. It's kind of torturous. And so the brain will extinguish those signals so as not to waste that energy.
Wow. So you're actually saying that one of the mechanisms is some part of you loses hope.
Yeah, but you can use that in a good way.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. That's why moderation is possible. If you teach yourself to lose hope that you can have bread whenever you feel like it all week long, and that you can only have bread at this one particular time, then a part of you loses hope that bread's available all week long, and you'll be sad for a little while, but then it'll feel like a blessing because you'll feel free to enjoy the bread on the weekends at the restaurant. You feel free to enjoy it in the situation that you're allowing. It actually makes food more enjoyable because you're not as scared of it. Only 2 out of 3 people seem to be able to do that for any given treat.
Uh-huh. Gotcha. So somebody might be able to do it for bread, but not for sugar, for example.
Absolutely. Yes, it seems to be different for different treats. And I tell people, if you've tried 4 conditional rules, like maybe you've tried to do it at a restaurant, maybe you've tried only to do it home and only with home baked bread. If you go through 4 different iterations and you're still not doing it, then it's probably time to give it up.
So you talked about, between the honeymoon and the extinction is the tantrum. And you also mentioned earlier this idea of willpower or, decision fatigue. Can you talk about how your approach takes advantage of that process of of decision fatigue?
Yeah. So first of all, it's important to recognize that the process exists and that it's not a straight down line like walking down the side of a mountain, because then you won't think there's something wrong with you when you have the sudden increase in the intensity of your cravings. A lot of people start to extinguish a particular behavior retreat, and then they're shocked by how difficult it is for that short period of time. But if you don't go into battle in a plastic helmet, if you're really prepared and you don't think there's something wrong with you, then you can ride it out. What does riding it out look like? Part of it involves minimizing all the other decisions you're going to have to make when you anticipate that tantrum is going to hit. Somewhere between 4 and 10 days for a daily habit, somewhere between 4 and 10 days after you begin the habit. Maybe you're planning an extra 2 10 or 15-minute breaks away from the rat race. Maybe you're putting down your smartphone and walking outside by yourself, have someone attend to the kids for a little while, and don't make any decisions for 10 or 15 minutes, just breathe. It does a world of good. It makes a really big difference. There are other things that are particularly important to take care of if you're going to resolve to only have to go through this once. It is kind of uncomfortable. The benefits are tremendous. You don't have to be tortured with cravings the rest of your life, but it's not just a walk in the park. Taking particularly good care of yourself with food otherwise. Unless a doctor says it's an emergency to lose weight, I suggest that when you are really attacking a particular craving, that you separate that process from the weight loss process. So do this because you want to prove to yourself that you can extinguish a craving, that you can take control. Make sure that you are regularly, reliably nutrifying yourself. This isn't a time to attack it with intermittent fasting. This is not a time to have one meal a day. This is a time to regularly, reliably eat healthy, nutritious food, probably 3 times a day at a maintenance level, more or less, so that you're not too hungry. It's also a good time to focus on lower glycemic foods. I'm not a dietitian or nutritionist, so I have to be careful when I say these kind of things, but I have seen about 2,000 people go through this. You know what that looks like if you are plant-based like you and I, is really focusing more on beans and greens and things that don't give you a very high glycemic hit. They don't really unbalance your blood sugar quickly and cause the high and the crash. You want things that keep you even all day. If you're more of a carnivore, it's like lean protein and greens. You want to feel relatively full and sated over the course of the day as you go through this. Then attending to things like sleep, trying to have a little more human connectedness, making sure that you've got some time to reach out to some friends. This is different than saying that relationships cause overeating. There's always an intervening variable where you can sever the link between emotional upset and overeating. However, human connectedness calms the nervous system. It's definitely a very strong need. It looks like, this is my latest hypothesis and a big part of what the future Cravings is about as opposed to the earlier books. It looks like when people are getting a case of the screw it, just screw it, just do it, I'll start tomorrow, that in addition to those cognitive justifications, those irrational thoughts that make it possible not to feel guilty while you're doing it, there is an irrationally perceived state of emergency in the brain where it just feels like you don't have everything you need right now and that some urgent action is required. And so the more that you can plan for, especially when you're going through the extinction curve and the temper tantrum, the more you can plan to take care of everything so you can stop and breathe and say, I do have what I need now. I have everything I need right now. The less likely it is that you're going to be overwhelmed by this case of the screw-its, which is really just your brain trying to force you to be less discriminating with food. And circling all the way back to the physiological connection to the pig or the food monster, it does appear that the pig has its greatest power when the survival mechanisms of the reptilian brain are most active, when that feast or famine response, fight or flight, when that part of the brain is active, it necessarily has the ability to push aside your rational thinking and your plans because, look, if there's a hungry bear chasing you and there's an emergency, that becomes the most important thing. You can understand that that's why this irrational perception of emergency is really the enemy that we need to fight. All those things together really help people power through the extinction curve. And there is another side, and it's much better than continuing to reinforce the craving forever. It's uncomfortable to go through the extinction, but it's a lot more uncomfortable to live with the craving indefinitely and all the damage you can do if you're overeating because of it.
Well, I think it's also much more comfortable to go through the extinction if you have a roadmap. You kind of know, oh, hey, here comes a rumble strip, here comes a speed bump, here comes a gate. Like it's when it's unexpected, and the stories we can tell ourselves are that we're broken, we're wrong, we're not doing it right, we must not really care, we must not be motivated, as opposed to like really, in a way, reducing it to this optimal brain, this amazing brain just doing its thing.
Yeah. And that it's not going to last forever.
Yeah, it's going this way because like you have a beautiful, brilliant brain that's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing.
Yes.
And once we understand that, and we know that, okay, here's why I have this wildly persuasive craving right now. And it's almost like we can take a step back from it. We can, bifurcate again instead and bifurcate it not from, the craving that's the enemy, but from the brain that's a wonder. And say, oh, look, here's my brain right now trying to get me to be less discriminating because it thinks there's an emergency or whatever. And we can kind of be above it and look at it in a feeling of appreciation and wonder and amazement rather than this inner struggle.
And that's so critical because that negative inner voice, if you allow it to take hold and say, why can't I stop eating? What's wrong with me? I'm pathetic. I'm a loser. I'm never going to get that. That diminishes your capacity to go through the extinction process at all. It just makes it look hopeless, and it doesn't give you inspiration and optimism to power through. More simplistic language, we say when the pig gets you to perseverate on guilt, it's just trying to get you to feel too weak to resist the next binge, which is a really piercing insight. And I remember I heard Carol Munter, I think it was, say it in this really poetic way. It's very difficult to keep on overeating if you refuse to keep yelling at yourself. This methodology makes it possible to stop yelling at yourself because you can look at what's happening with wonder and appreciation for what's going on in your brain and just learn to leverage it in your favor.
I love that. Can you talk for a minute about the rules from just a practical standpoint? Like, what does it look like to make rules, and how do they work?
It's better to start with a low bar. I actually discovered this on my own, but BJ Fogg says it better in a book called Tiny Habits. Motivation comes and goes. What most people do is they live on this feast and famine roller coaster where they're not only overeating, but they're also really good dieters. But it's not sustainable on either front. You can't keep overeating the way you're overeating without doing a lot of damage. And you can't keep dieting the way you've been dieting without doing a lot of damage, because the motivation to stay on a strict diet doesn't last. And so if you say, I'm going to have 700 calories until I get to my goal weight, there's going to come a day when you wake up and you don't have the mojo, and so you don't do it, and that whole process of demoralizations comes. Whereas if you pick a lower bar, you take one simple rule, like I'll always put my fork down between bites, or I'll never go back for seconds, or I'll take a picture of my food before I eat it, or I won't have chocolate during the week. If you pick a low bar and teach yourself that there is something that you can do with consistency, then the identity forming mechanisms in your brain take hold. So if you see yourself not having chocolate during the week over the course of a month, you start to think, well, maybe I'm just becoming a person who doesn't eat chocolate. And it becomes part of your character over time. And this is what makes it possible to not have to obsessively think about rules all day long. It's the same thing with driving. We don't think about the rules of the road all day long. We just kind of do it because it's part of who we are. We are drivers. Be mindful driving between the lights, but your brain just automatically stops at lights because you're a person who doesn't run red lights. Character trumps willpower. And so starting with one small rule, one simple rule that probably won't cause you to wake up skinny tomorrow, but it will point things in the right direction and make you feel like you're not powerless or hopeless or pathetic, or can start to develop a success identity. That's how we get people started. This has a mind-blowingly positive effect. The only time that it can be trouble, usually what happens is people pick that one rule, and the positive impact on their self-esteem from following it makes them want to eat healthier overall over the course of the day. And they don't lose weight at first, but they also are not allowing their pigs to run rampant on everything else. They're just generally trying to eat healthy. Sometimes you do get symptom substitution, and they just wind up eating all kinds of other unhealthy things. Then you want to change one simple rule to the simplest set of rules that really protects you. So you can add a couple of more if you need to. I formulate the rule using the words never again or always, because our pigs are like 2-year-olds, or they're not mature enough to consider that you might change the rule later on. When my niece was 2 years old, I told her she could never, ever cross the road without holding my hand. Never, ever, ever, ever again. Of course, I knew that was a lie. It's just she wasn't mature enough to have those images in her head. It was too dangerous. So I knew that when she was old enough, we'd teach her to go both ways, but I told her a little lie. And why can't you lie to the pig? It's been lying to you for all these years. Why can't you fight fire with fire? So I recommend we present these rules to our pig as if they're set in stone. But if you really need to change them, you do it with forethought and consideration. You sit down and you write down what you want to change, exactly what the new rule would be. You write down why you want to do that. And then you sit with it for 24 hours before you actually make the change. That way, you know that you're making the change and not your pig. And it prevents eating on impulse and whim and emotion, which is really the essence of food problems. It's eating on impulse and whim and emotion rather than what you sat down over the weekend and planned out was going to be your strategy for going forward and meeting your health and fitness goals.
One more question?
Yeah.
So you've talked about kind of separating this process from weight loss. So how do you think about using the scale now?
It's not a total separation from weight loss, it's a delay. It's prioritizing teaching yourself that you do have control and you've got the ability to go through these extinction curves. It's prioritizing that. It's kind of like the back door to weight loss. Then you slowly adjust the rules to create a slight caloric deficit and you keep flooding your body with nutrition so that you're taking care of yourself and you're not too hungry at any point. And then people fairly reliably lose weight. It's not really the goal of our program, but that's usually what happens. Ask me the question again. The question was.
How do you think about using the scale? Because I remember early on, you talked about the scale the same way that, a pilot would use GPS or a driver would look at the lines. Like you were pretty adamant that, if you want to lose weight, you weigh yourself. And, there's a lot of, again, argument in the weight loss world about, that people get triggered by the scale and they, the scale is somehow judging them and making them feel bad. And right, but you kind of said like it's necessary. So I'm wondering, has your views changed? How do you think about it?
It's changed a little bit. The research goes in both directions. So I don't think the controversy has really been resolved scientifically yet. Early on, and largely this is still what I think, the scale wasn't the problem. It was our emotional reaction to the scale. I was trained in a scientist practitioner program, and we were taught that in a multivariate environment, which is just something where a lot of things affect the outcome, that you needed a lot of observational data to ferret out what was happening. You couldn't really run your regression equations with any type of consistent output unless you had hundreds of observations to kind of ferret it all out. And I always thought that what that means for your weight is that, yes, it's going to vary a lot on a day-to-day basis due to how big a bowel movement did you have, and is it that time of month, and how salty was your dinner, and what time do you weigh yourself, because we lose weight via respiration over the course of just breathing while we're sleeping. So if you weigh yourself a couple hours later, you're going to be a little bit. There are all these variations that don't really have anything to do with whether you're losing weight or not, or gaining weight or not. But I always figured over time, those canceled each other out. There are these tools online that will allow you to statistically remove that noise, and they'll just kind of graph it for you what the trend is doing. And there are even scales that will do that for you and not show you a number, just show you a color. So I always felt like it was necessary to have a mechanism for measurement. And as I would use that, I would find myself less obsessed with the number. It just became like information, and I desensitized to it. So I gave them a spreadsheet. I said, just enter your data every day. This will calculate the trend for you and pay more attention to the trend than the daily weight, and it won't become such an emotional issue. And then we would deal with all the things the pig would say when they got on the scale as squeals, just like anything else. We would look at the rationality and irrationality behind them. But then over the course of working with 2,000 people, I ran into a lot of people who said the scale was very triggering for them, and they just didn't want to face that. They just didn't want to do that. They had all these other ways of knowing, like would have a pair of jeans that they would get into every week just to see how they were doing. Or somebody told me about this tribe in Africa where people tie a string around their bellies and they know if the string is getting tight or looser. And there were even people who just wanted no measurement at all that did perfectly fine. They would focus more on just eating whole foods or, having a very, very specific and limited number of treats. They knew when they were on or off plan and when things were going well or not. I saw that the more serious an eating problem people had, the more difficult the scale tended to be for them, particularly with people who were purging. And so I became a lot more open-minded about it. And I still think it's a little better to measure than not to measure, but if you really don't want to, it's not the most critical thing. What's important is that you have a plan. You have some way of just knowing whether you're getting better or worse. And if you have that, I don't think it's necessary to weigh in every day. I used to weigh in every day. I weigh in twice a week now. I just find I'm a little less obsessed with the number, and I know where I am, but it doesn't change that much. That's what I feel about the scale. I think probably measuring is better. I probably still think the feedback is better. Just like when you're aiming at the bullseye, you want to know if you missed it, by how much and in what direction, so you can make adjustments. I think we are learning machines, and by having that constant feedback, you can make those constant little adjustments and get to where you want to go. But I don't fight as hard as I used to about that.
Gotcha. Anything else that you think would be useful for folks to understand about your approach and your system, or have we covered it?
I think we've covered it. I think it sounds a little harsh in the abstract, and so I recorded a whole bunch of coaching sessions in case people aren't on the list, which are free. You can get them at defeatyourcravings.com and click the big blue button. I've got a large set of food plan templates so people can see what typical rules look like for different dietary philosophies. Whole foods, ketogenic, point counting, calorie counting, whatever you do, we have a set of food plan templates. And it's all at defeatyourcravings.com. Click the big blue button. And Howie, I really want to thank you for doing this with me. People don't know this is the third time we tried to record this because we had technical problems. So hopefully 3 times is a charm.
Rehearsals are not the worst thing in the world.
That's true. That's very true.
And, and this was very different than the others. So I keep learning. We're evolving. I hope people can hear both the humility and compassion and passion in your voice for helping people and helping people liberate themselves from cravings. Because, I've known you for a long time, and like I just want to say what you probably wouldn't or can't say yourself is like you are so committed to helping people find their way out of suffering.
It was the bane of my existence. Thanks, Howie. I hope I'm still humble.
Yeah, after that, right? I broke you.
It's funny. Thanks, Howie. Hey, this is Glenn and Howie Part 2. We started having a conversation offline that we thought should be continued in the recording. Howie, I forgot how the conversation started, but we wound up talking about the idea that binging is not a unitary habit, it's a collection of habits. And what I mean by that is that most cravings are associated with a couple of different food signals. Usually 80% of the craving is associated with one signal, and so people make an awful lot of progress when they extinguish one. But to really overcome the craving, you need to root out the other signals as well. So, for example, let's say that Sally has a pizza habit when she's driving home from work every day. And she stops at a particular pizzeria and she has some pizza, and then she is really upset with herself and wishes she didn't do it. And so she listens to the audio and she decides to make a rule that says, I'll never have pizza on the way home from work again. And she goes through the extinction curve, and it's uncomfortable for a little while, but she successfully gets through the temper tantrum. And 30 days later, the pizza place on the way home from work is no longer really calling to her, at least not that much. It's like 20% of what it was, maybe less. She knows it's going to continue to go down from there. However, Sally also used to go have pizza with her dad every week on the weekend until she moved to another city for a new job. And, after a couple of months feeling blissfully craving free, she visits her dad and she winds up having pizza. And she feels like she's failed. This is a big problem because people think that that represents a failure, but she didn't fail. What actually happened is that she successfully extinguished the craving from the pizza place on the way home, but she didn't extinguish her dad in his apartment as a signal for pizza. So she has to go through that extinction curve too, which will take longer because she sees her dad less frequently. She'll need a rule that really protects her, and she'll need to attend to it as a serious endeavor to get through that curve at her dad's place on the way home. That's what we mean when we say that binging is not a unitary habit, it's a collection of habits. Our inner pigs will say, well, that makes it impossible. It really doesn't, because about 80% of the problem is usually associated with a very, very small set of triggers. It just means that you have to understand the way the brain works and make a list of all the potential triggers and make a plan for dealing with them.
Right. And I'm imagining that you can and maybe should interpret a new context as, oh, great, I'm making progress. Like there's not an infinite number of them. There might be 3 or 4, but it's almost like you're doing like a kind of brain surgery on yourself.
You can say, great, I found a new trigger. It's an opportunity to be even freer of this problem.
Awesome.
And that brings us to the end of today's broadcast of Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston. If you'd like to find out more about the products and services Dr. Glenn offers to help you dramatically reduce your cravings and stop overeating in 90 days or less, please visit defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. That's defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. Thanks.